Hello. Tonight I'd like to share with you a curious story of a French ghost who sang in English. And this will be the story of a culture shift of Gastona Leroux's Le Fantôme de l'Opéra into the English language cultures, so all of the adaptations of a story now considered to be a classic by many called The Phantom of the Opera. And the history of the reception of Gastona Leroux's novel, Le Fantôme de l'Opéra, is one of the most interesting cases of cultural shifts in modern popular culture. The now classic story was written in French by a French author, set in Paris, and featured a cast of French characters. Mostly, not exclusively, but most of them are definitely French people. It was first serialized in a daily conservative newspaper called Le Gallois, as you can see here, then very quickly published in book form in 1910 by a Parisian publishing house of Pierre Lafitte and Company. Leroux's reputation by that time was quite well established as a writer of popular crime thrillers. By that time he had published two successful detective novels called The Mystery of the Yellow Room and its sequels, The Perfume of the Lady in Black, in the first decade of the 20th century. They were almost immediately translated into English, that's why I give you the English titles. Le Fantôme was a tale of terror, blackmail and kidnapping committed by a lovelorn, facially deformed genius, Eric, posing as the title Phantom, in one of the most iconic buildings of the Parisian Belle Epoque, the Palais Garnier Opera House. You can still visit it in Paris, it's very much worth your visit. For a contemporary reader, in the first years of the 20th century, it was largely perceived as a roman naclé. It means a story with some sort of hidden meaning, with recognizable celebrities such as the prima donnas Christine Nielsen and Adelina Patti, disguised as rival sopranos Christine Daae and La Carlotta, beside many historical characters such as operatic composers, singers, and some, of course not all, but some of the managers of the opera house. An interesting inclusion was a mysterious Persian, a historical opera lover recently identified in an article by Raj Shah as Mohammed Ismail Khan, an exiled Persian aristocrat living in Paris on a British pension. The Persian was given a fictional biography by Leroux, who made him into one of the major characters of his novel, the only one who could actually provide some background information about Eric, his talents, and his Middle Eastern travels. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Le Fantôme de l'Opéra is the novel's style, characterized by historians and theoreticians of literature as betwixt and between. This is what Gerald Hoggle wrote in his book on the Phantom, or unsettling and unsettled. This is by one of the novel's recent retranslators into English, Mireille Ribière. The novel combines several different influences deriving from French and Anglophone traditions. And here we have a slide. I'll just let you look at it for a while. So what we have are various traditions. Of course, there is the operatic tradition, so the allusions and references to many works of classical opera, most importantly Gounod's Faust, but you can have some other elements either quoted in the narrative as the operas that are staged in Paris and the characters perform in them, or referenced through the plot of the novel. So we have the operatic tradition, and then we have two rival traditions of the Gothic, mostly the Anglophone Gothic. So you can have some names here. I'll talk about it in a little moment, but definitely Leroux was inspired by the Anglophone Gothic tradition, and at the same time the French tradition of le fantastique. So the fantastic in literature, which is a slightly different concept comprising literary fairy tales and the decadent poetry, also the so-called dark novels, black novels of Victor Hugo and Jules Verne and Balzac, and also, of course, the tradition of detective novel, which was something that Leroux himself was involved in. So there you have quite a complex web of interactions and influences already in the original novel. And what is quite important to notice at this point is that English connection, the English language connection, so British and American. And Leroux himself must have been aware of the English influences in his novels. In a text entitled To My Friends on the Other Side of the Channel, in Britain means, he listed his literary fascinations with English and American writers, notably Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling, George Herbert Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe. He was also an admirer of the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, whose rationalistic approach to crime solving he tried to mimic in his novels, featuring the young detective Joseph Rouletabille. So, The Mystery of the Yellow Room and The Perfume of the Lady in Black I mentioned already. Surprisingly, the novel itself, at least until the most recent studies of Gerald Hoggle or Mark Everest, Newark Cormack or Raj Shah, I will give you the short bibliography on the last slide, so if you'd like to read these things for yourself, absolutely go ahead, they are fascinating. So the novel itself received very bad comments from the scholarly world. For example, here we have some comments of those derogatory criticisms. Mary Ellen Snodgrass, in her Encyclopedia of Gothic Literature, calls Gastona Leroux a writer of serialized potboilers coloured with melodrama, mystery and orientalism. Another one, Catherine Wildkin, embarks on wholesale condemnation in her 1996 article, Making the Shadow Conscious. And I quote here, "The popularity of this novel is nearly incomprehensible. It features a ludicrous plot, cardboard characters, and careless writing. Only the Lloyda Webbera show turned the fourth-rate novel into an extraordinary musical." We'll talk about this musical in a moment. It should be noted, though, that the musical director, the famous Hal Prince, called Leroux's novel a first-rate book when The Fantôme first opened on Broadway in 1988. Still in 1990, another literary historian, Harriet Hawkins, complained in her book Classics and Trash that until very recently it would most certainly have been academic suicide to admit any interest in, much less an enjoyment of, certain works popular with bourgeois audiences, such as The Phantom of the Opera. This is what inspired me to do my PhD, really. On the other hand, a few non-English scholars have dealt with the works of Gastona Leroux, such as Roberto Barbolini, and especially the French specialist on Leroux, Isabelle Casta-Husson, have been generally more favorably inclined toward The Phantom. Perhaps then, at least partially, the novel's unfortunate reception in the English language academia was caused by problems with the English translation. And as you can see, there were many translations over the years. The first one appeared very quickly, and it's still most available in English. Sometimes it's uncredited, but it was made by quite a well-known and experienced translator called Alexander Teixeira de Matos. Now it is in public domain, so everybody republishes it. You can find it online. Unfortunately, the translator removed around 100 pages of content from the original. The first American edition also featured color plates by French illustrator André Castagne that were to become an important source of inspiration for the Universal Studios film adaptation of the novel in 1925. You can see one of them here on the cover. The reign of Teixeira de Matos's translation lasted very long. The next translation of the Phantom of the Opera, sadly still abridged, appeared as late as 1990, spurred by the spectacular success of Andrew Lloyda Webber's musical. The first complete rendition was done in 1996 by Leonard Woolf, but it contained several serious mistranslations, and the added annotations were sometimes rather misleading. There is, for example, a rather glaring example of a convoluted mythical and literary explication of Leroux's use of the name Valerius, which in fact was a reference to the name of the benefactors, the family name of the benefactors of the historical diva Christine Nielsen, one of the major inspirations for the character of Christine Daae. The 2004 retranslation by the American-French husband and wife team Randy and Jean-Marc L'Officier is rather an adaptation of Leroux's work than that does not even attempt to convey its sometimes peculiar writing style. The well-annotated translation by English and French philologist Mireille Ribière of 2009 also offers a paraphrase of Leroux's text. Arguably, the version that comes closest to the original is 2012 translation by David Coward. However, another very promising one seems to be on the way, made by Kathleen G. Freeman. So far, she has discovered, translated, and published a chapter of Leroux's novel that was omitted from the book edition. So here we have a slide with all those English language translations. As you can see, there is a long gap. And the next slide is with the Polish translations, if you're interested. So similarly, the novel was translated very quickly. It was first serialized in press, then the same translation by a translator called Maria Segeny was published in book form with a different title. The title was Duch Opery. Then there was one, unfortunately anonymous translation in 1926, on the wave of the popularity of the Universal movie. Then 1948, the same translation was republished, and then again in the 90s. So they are inspired by the great international success of the musical by Andrew Lloyda Webber. So there were two translations in the modern times. The first one by Bożena Sęk, heavily abridged. There's like 1/3 of the novel missing. And the next one by Andrzej Wiśniewski, which has recently been reviewed, remade by yours truly, and re-edited for the 2019 publication by Vesper. So if you are looking for a good Polish edition, excuse a bit of self-promotion, but this is really something to look for. So I mentioned the film adaptations, and the first one was actually a German attempt, which is now considered missing and lost. So perhaps someone somewhere will discover a hidden film reel with this one. But the one that really made it into the popular culture was made in Hollywood by Universal Studios. Gastona Leroux was very interested in the developing film technology. He also started writing film scripts. In 1918, he set up a film company called Société de Ciné-Roman, in collaboration with writer and opera librettist Arthur Berned and actor René Navarre, famous for his role of another mysterious French criminal, Fantôme. The company aimed to publish novels and turn them into films. For example, in 1922, they produced a 10-episode cinema serial. There were such things, apparently, based on the adventures of detective Joseph Rouletabille, one of the characters created by Leroux. Finally, however, Leroux decided to launch the film adaptation of Le Fantôme in Hollywood. In 1922, he met the founder of the Universal Studios, Carl Laemmle, gave him a tour of the Palais Garnier and tried to interest him in the novel. Probably he was not aware that the success of the adaptation, directed by Rupert Julian and starring Lon Chaney, the legendary master of characterization called The Man of 1,000 Faces, would completely overshadow the literary source. The 1925 film influenced the reception of Leroux's novel like no other adaptation before the 1986 British musical. It situated the Phantom in the Gothic tradition, linking the tale of the alleged haunting of the opera house with tales of supernatural horror, particularly that of Dracula. In fact, the Phantom and the vampire count have largely evolved together on film. The popularity of the silent phantom led the Universal Studios to produce a highly successful series of horror movies, initiated in 1931 by Todd Browning's Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Interestingly, originally it was Lon Chaney who was supposed to play the Count, but unfortunately he died of throat cancer before the filming started. And if we look at the cultural history of Dracula and the Phantom, they look similar. They look surprisingly similar. They took very similar paths again. For example, soon enough, in the spectacular, sexy and gory horror films made in Britain by the Hammer Studios. So, what we have is a whole series of film remakes. First, the few remakes, of course all of them in English language. There were other cinematographies, especially Spanish language in South America, the cinematographies that started to be influenced by the Phantom, and also Chinese, which is quite interesting and quite different from the original. But let's look at the English version adaptations. So first, a few of the adaptations that keep the original title, The Phantom of the Opera. The remake by Universal, 1943, then another American horror story with Robert Englund, whom you may remember from his role of Freddy Krueger in Nightmare on Elm Street, and a two-part television film with Charles Dance from 1990, and you can see they move away from the literary source, which is sometimes even uncredited. So we have more music, special music composed for the film, for this Universal adaptation, the first color film to feature the Phantom. We have definitely more horror in the 80s. This is the golden age of teen horror, as you'll see in a little moment. So we have this kind of supernatural story, time travel, the pact with the devil, a little bit like the story of Faust, and of course the tragic and terrifying love triangle between Phantom Christine and her suitor, who in the original novel is called Raoul de Chagny. In the last one here, we have more romance. We have the use of original 19th century opera music, but the plot goes in a completely different direction, making the Phantom a sympathetic character who is mistreated by the society on account of his hideous looks. He does have a mother, a father. There is this rather recurrent theme. It will happen in a lot of fan fiction, for example, that Christine resembles physically the Phantom's mother. for good or for bad. She could have been very good, angelic and caring, or she could have been horrible and mistreating. So we have these three things happening in film adaptations. And then the next slide, what we have is the versions of the Phantom of the Opera that move away from the opera. The opera as a genre has become too old and uninteresting, and probably not considered appropriate for younger audiences that the creators wanted to attract. So we have, for example, rock and roll in Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise. It's all moved to a rock concert hall. We have teen revenge in Phantom of the Mall. So there is no music, there is no theater or opera, not even rock music. What we have is a kind of angsty teenager who wants to take revenge on the world, and he hides in a deserted shopping mall, a fixture of the 80s, in America especially. Then at the turn of the century, we start having family entertainment thrown in. So it's no longer scary. It's moving away from the horror genre towards what you might call family film. So here we have a group of kids investigating a supposed haunting of a megaplex cinema. So as you can see, there are some strange things happening, all in the English language culture. So that's really very clearly the same direction that 19th century Gothic novels would be taking in modern popular culture in the English-speaking world. So more horror, more gore, or on the other hand, more romance, or perhaps something to attract the younger generation of viewers, or even families with children. The most important, the most influential adaptation, however, would be the musical with the music composed by Andrew Lloyda Webbera, the man who received an aristocratic title for his importance in the musical theatre in Britain. This is the most influential adaptation on many levels. It has been the longest running musical ever in London and in New York. For 35 years it accumulated a rich cultural history of its own. Here we have a slide with all the things happening to this musical. So the premieres in London and New York, and then we have the non-replica productions. Actually there were Polish non-replica productions as well, usually with a lower budget and some things, important things like stage direction changed from the original. There was the film adaptation made by Joel Schumacher with the full approval and even partial participation by Lloyd Webber in 2004. So something that you may recall perhaps. And there was a sequel called Love Never Dies. So all these things happened that we could really have a separate talk on just the cultural history of this musical, but let me show you a few slides comparing the masks of the Phantom, the faces, the characterization of the Phantom character between the first film, the one with Lon Chaney, and the adaptation of the musical with Gerald Butler playing the Phantom. He doesn't have the name Eric in this one, he's just called the Phantom. So as you can see, it's evident that the character is growing. Younger sexier, more alluring. The mask is significantly smaller. It was made smaller in the stage version of the musical already, but in the film it's just like a quarter of the face, whereas in the book and in the first adaptation it covered the entire face of the Fantôme, and for a reason, because he had a very serious deformation of the face. You can see the famous characterization of Lon Chaney here, compared with Gerald Butler's characterization in the Joel Schumacher film, which was sometimes called, quite maliciously, a case of bad sunburn. Yep, that's where you go. If we look at the stage version, it is more romantic. It's kind of melodrama. To some extent, the same thing happened to Dracula. That's why you have this slide comparing the still from the original stage production of the musical with Bram Stoker's Dracula. So an adaptation of the Dracula tale. But even if we look at the stage productions, the Phantoms grow younger and slimmer, and actually this one, Ramin Karimloo, has a very good voice, but it kind of ceases to be the most important thing about the Fantôme. So let's look a little bit on the, here we have some fun art making fun of that. So the fact that the Fantôme is really growing younger and sexier and more alluring, while professing that he's still the ugliest man in the world and he's completely deformed, and only his beautiful voice and his musical talent are his saving graces. Interestingly, or perhaps most worryingly, there is this move towards the Fantôme family, creating the Fantôme family in the sequel, Love Never Dies. So here we have the Fantôme family with a child, or in other media and popular culture directed towards the younger audiences, like the very popular franchise Monster High. They included a character called Operetta, and she's supposed to be the daughter of the Fantôme of the opera. So let's now look at the French. So what about the French? Has any of the adaptations been made in French culture? Actually, not very many, as you'll see in a moment. So after Leroux's Hollywood fling, the French culture, at least the popular culture, disowned the most iconic Parisian monster, beside Quasimodo, of course, and left him for the English-speaking audiences. Compared with countless English-language film, theatre and book adaptations of the Phantom of the Opera, the French have produced only a few. Let's look at them. They're quite interesting. So the earliest versions were actually comic books. This is a particularly French form of popular culture, very popular in France and Francophone countries. And the earliest of the comics was made in 1971. It was reissued in 1990. As you can see, very strange cover. It was made by George Bielet, if that's the way you pronounce his name, and it definitely had very little to do with the original Le Fantôme de l'Opéra. The story is set in Vienna. It features a flirtatious Russian prima ballerina, Natasha Berova, and her former lover, Oleg, also a dancer, who is disfigured in a fire started by Natasha's jealous husband. He returns and tries to take his revenge on the ballerina's current suitors. A dashing Inspector Hunter investigates the crime. Actually, the name Inspector Hunter echoed the romantic hero of the Hammer version of the Phantom from 1962, in which Gastona Leroux was not even credited. Another comic was published in 1989 by André Paul Duchateau. It was again reissued in France and in the Netherlands in 2001. It combined the story of the Phantom of the Opera with the adventures of Leroux's young detective hero Joseph Rouletabille, which is quite interesting because he might be seen as the narrator in the original novel. His technique of detective work is quite similar. This is kind of Conan Doyle inspired, scholarly crime solving. But the comic cast Rouletabille in the role played in the novel by Raoul de Chagny, the aristocratic suitor and fiancé later of Christine Daae. Otherwise, the comic follows the plot quite closely, and definitely the connection between these two characters, the two novels created by Leroux is quite interesting. The most recent of the French comics, written and illustrated by Christophe Gauthier, was published in 2 volumes between 2011 and 2013. It appears to be quite fairly close adaptation of Leroux's book, except that the names of the main characters are for some unexplained reason changed from Christine and Raoul to Ingrid and Pierre. We don't know why. At least Eric remained Eric. There is an interesting thing because one of the adaptations was actually staged on the stage of the Palais Garnier, and this was the ballet. It featured the music of Marcel Landowski and choreography of a very famous choreographer, Roland Petit. It was staged in 1980, so quite a while ago. And just like this first 1971 comic, it moved the story from the world of classical singing to the world of classical dance. It presented the story of a nameless young woman, the main character was called like this, tutored by a mysterious and jealous dancing instructor who finally had to give her up to a young man, the equivalent of Raoul from the novel. In 2010 there was another stage variation, a drama play by Henry Lazzarini. This was probably the first adaptation of Leroux's work that moved away from the genre of the musical play and concentrated on spoken language, largely adapted from the novel. There were only some inclusions of arias taken from famous operas, but otherwise this was a spoken theatre play. So, compared with a plethora of literary retellings in English, there have been very surprisingly few in French, except perhaps a few cases of fan fiction, and they all appeared after the original Phantom's centenary in 2010. So what we have is really a very different attitudes taken by French and English language cultures towards the popular cultural legacy. It looks like the French highbrow culture rejected the Phantom. It proved inspirational to some minor works of popular art, but they failed to capitalize on something that has been extremely profitable, especially if we consider Lloyd Webber's musical, in the English language cultures. In the very recent years, something seems to be changing at last. Perhaps it's just a material appeal of the commercial success enjoyed by the anglicized Phantom. First of all, there was a plan to have a replica version of the musical staged in Paris in French, but it was postponed indefinitely because of the fire in the venue. So we do not know whether or not they will finally stage it. And there is something I'd like to draw your attention to as the last thing. Un monstre à Paris, a family film, an animated movie which takes Fantôme as the inspiration to some sort of family entertainment, but it breaks with the central love triangle and the crazed composer and all this quintessentially Fantôme elements of it, making it a story of friendship, of fantasy. As you can see, perhaps visually it is similar a little. We have this masked character and we have the singer with angel wings, and Christine in the novel is sometimes called the angel of music, and this is what she calls her tutor as well. The same happens in the musical, but spoiler alert, the main hero here, the Fantôme character, is not even human. He is a magically humanized flea, for all things. The premise of the whole film, very interesting one and beautifully made and with nice music, is very far from being romantic. And two last slides. One is a photo I made in the Palais Garnier, and apparently at some point before 2015, the special plaque was added in the Palais Garnier on box 5, the Phantoms box. So it has the indication that this is the Phantoms box, La Loge du Fantôme de l'Opéra. So something that hasn't been acknowledged in Palais Garnier ever. Now, for probably commercial reasons to attract tourists, and probably the tourists were asking about that, there is this indication, and of course you can buy some books and materials connected also to Leroux and his novel in the opera shop. So as you can see, it's quite interesting, and probably we are in for some new adaptations in the future, because yes, the Phantoms never die, and the cultural impact of Leroux's story will probably continue to be strong. And if you'd like to read more about that, here is a list of selected bibliography which I used here in preparation of this talk. So thank you and enjoy other presentations. Goodbye.